Donald ran his 2024 presidential campaign on patriotism, what he referred to as American pride, as well as a promise to make things better for the everyday American. What we've gotten instead is a president who is cutting, gutting, sabotaging, and misusing agencies that were designed, for the most part, to protect Americans, their livelihoods, and their lives. His malpractice has already had dire consequences, and the consequences are getting worse by the day. Why? Well, because his behavior is dangerous, and it is not just un American, it is anti American. So I want to start with Donald's out of bounds abuse of the National Guard. As we know, on August 11th, National Guard forces began occupying an American city, Washington, D.C. The occupation, which unfortunately he can get away with, the executive branch can get away with, because Washington, D.C. does not have the protection of belonging to a state, is not a state in its own right, has entered a new alarming phase. NBC News reported yesterday that, quote, National Guard troops deployed to Washington this month to support Donald's effort to mitigate crime began carrying firearms Sunday evening, unquote. Well, the problem I have with that quote, though, is that it legitimizes the bogus reason Donald has given for justifying his occupation of American cities. He has no interest in lowering crime in DC or anywhere else. But yes, let's arm National Guardsmen who, by the way, are not trained to deal with law enforcement issues. At a press conference this morning, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had this to say about this, quite frankly, horrifying update.
Grateful to be doing it, whether they're DC National Guard or other state National Guards, and at your direction as well, sir. It's just common sense to make sure they're armed as well. And so we're rolling out ensuring they're armed, capable of defending themselves and others if need be, supporting law enforcement, and we're proud to be there, sir.
Wow, Donald looks so engaged by all of this. You think he could be bothered to wake up while listening to the Secretary of Defense talk about how he is justifying arming National Guardsmen in an American city to patrol the citizens in that city. This is absolutely unheard of. Not only that, you know when would have been an appropriate time to deploy the National Guard? Well, when thousands of people at Donald's behest were storming the Capitol and threatening to murder the Vice President of the United States, the Speaker of the House, and any other congresspeople or congressional staffers, or for all we know, anybody who worked in that building with harm. Where was his willingness to call the National Guard on that day? There's zero justification for what is happening in DC right now. There is zero legitimate justification for it. All this is meant to do is provoke confrontation and spread fear, and the likelihood of this escalating into real violence in which somebody is going to get hurt rises every day. During that same press conference, we got another hint at what this unlawful National Guard occupation of DC is going. This is not going to stop in DC. This time, it was Donald giving us the news. Take a look.
Order National Guard troops, though, into American cities if those governors don't request the federal deployment?
I am, but I also think that, look, Chicago, everybody knows how bad it is. Everybody standing there knows. We know. You don't have to be doing any studies. They should be saying, please come in. Pritzker should be saying that. You know, I did a favor for Christy Whitmer.
So, yes, now he's threatening to go into Chicago or send National Guard troops to Chicago, another blue, very diverse American city. We don't need studies to know how bad it is. We just need to take Donald at his word. I was actually in Chicago a few weeks ago, and it's lovely this time of year. In that clip, we also saw yet another sign of Donald's mental decline. He meant to refer to Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, but he confused her with Christy Whitman, who was governor of New Jersey back in the 90s and then administrator of the EPA under George W. Bush. So, yes, it is true that Donald is stuck in the past. Her name is Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and there is no universe in which Governor Whitmer is going to thank Donald for sending armed National Guard troops to any city in her state. Nobody wants Donald deploying troops anywhere, let alone on American soil, which, again, last I checked, as long as the Constitution still exists, is unconstitutional. He has also threatened to send troops into other very diverse, many of them mostly Black, Democratic cities, Baltimore, New York City, San Francisco, and Oakland, because that is what wannabe authoritarian assholes do. While Donald takes this seriously anti-American step of sending our own troops out into our cities to intimidate us, to frighten us from peaceably assembling, from protesting, he's also eliminating measures meant to protect us, because that's another thing that wannabe authoritarian assholes do. This morning, the New York Times reported that over 180 FEMA employees sent a letter to Congress warning that Donald's plans for the agency will likely have horrible consequences. Who could have seen that coming? This is not guesswork. These people know what they're talking about because they rely on things like science and data. Donald's dangerous agenda threatens to undo improvements made by the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. That's the law that passed in the wake of the government's slow, devastating, and disastrous response in 2005 to Hurricane Katrina. The Times writes, quote, that landmark law imposed new eligibility criteria for FEMA administrators, requiring that they have a, quote, demonstrated ability in and knowledge of emergency management, unquote. It also prohibited the Homeland Security Secretary from interfering with FEMA's authorities, responsibilities, and functions, unquote. So naturally, Donald and those and others in the executive branch have completely violated both parts of that landmark legislation. Donald has appointed 2 acting FEMA administrators with no experience whatsoever in managing disaster relief agencies, and his Department of Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem has interfaced with FEMA operations by imposing spending cuts that were partially responsible for the delayed response to July's catastrophic flooding in Texas. So let's see what the DHS secretary, cosplayer and puppy murderer Kristi Noem, who has no legal right to interfere with FEMA, had to say in July on NBC News about her interference with FEMA.
I think the president recognizes that FEMA should not exist the way that it always has been. It needs to be redeployed in a new way, and that's what we did during this response. If you saw, it's not just FEMA that can respond in these situations. The federal government has all kinds of assets, and we deployed them. The Coast Guard coming in and saving individuals with their rescue swimmers, with their helicopters. They had a fixed-wing aircraft deployed as well. Border Patrol with their BORTAC teams, and now we've got...
I love it that she actually thinks she comes across as knowing what the hell she's talking about. First of all, it's always a tell when they claim that Donald wants something. He doesn't know what FEMA stands for, let alone what it does. Noem also said, quote, FEMA shouldn't exist as it always has, unquote. It doesn't. FEMA has been reformed, especially since Hurricane Katrina, many times in order better to respond to the increasingly severe and more frequent natural disasters that are being caused by catastrophic climate change. Noem has no authority to interfere with the agency anyway, so her opinion here doesn't really matter, and yet she's interfering. And there's no pushback as far as I'm aware. The FEMA response to Texas was slow, partially because of Nome's interference. But imagine how much worse FEMA's performance is going to get once Donald's changes to the agency continue to take effect. And they will, because at this point, who is going to stop them? It is yet another instance, though, in the ways in which Donald Trump does not care at all about American lives. In a slap in the face to our country's veterans, those we have the strongest obligation to protect, Donald is stripping vital services from them. As a supposed staunch Republican, Donald must, of course, understand that we do have that duty to protect our veterans, to take care of them in return for their service to this country. No. Well, first of all, he's not really a Republican anyway. Secondly, no Republicans care about this issue anymore. They may pretend to, but they support all of these anti-VA policies that the Trump regime is trying to put into place, and in many cases succeeding in putting into place. He's making disastrous cuts to the Department of Veterans Affairs. He's making moves to privatize healthcare, cut staff, cancel programs. These changes could leave millions of veterans at risk. A piece published on commondreams.org yesterday reports that, quote, so far in 2025, the VA lost 600 doctors and 1,900 nurses. During the first 3 months of the year, about 40% of doctors who were offered jobs declined, 4 times the rejection rate a year earlier. In March 2025, a leaked memo revealed Donald's plan to eliminate 83,000 jobs from the VA, which is as much as 15% of the agency's workforce. After major pushback from veterans, the agency announced it would only need to cut 30,000 jobs because so many staff had agreed to leave voluntarily, unquote. Voluntarily, well, that's one way of putting it, but I think in this context, voluntarily is just a synonym for pushed out, which is what has happened across agencies throughout the federal government. And by the way, I know that 30,000 job cuts is fewer than 83,000 job cuts, but that is still going to leave vital departments in the VA seriously understaffed. The piece from which I just read also recalls Abraham Lincoln's insistence on our country's obligation, quote, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, unquote. Donald does not understand service. He doesn't value it. He doesn't respect it. He does not respect those who serve our country. So he certainly isn't going to lift a finger to help them or their widows or their children. There is nothing more un-American than leaving our veterans to fend for themselves. This country has never taken adequate care of its veterans. But under the Trump regime, life for veterans is going to get that much worse, not because the bureaucracy is poorly designed, not because of lack of budget, but because Donald and others in the Trump regime are actually intentionally targeting the VA in ways that will inevitably harm our veterans. What else could we expect from a man who has called soldiers suckers and losers, including those who have lost their lives in defense of this country? Now, as I said earlier, the Republican Party was supposed to be the party that cared about veterans. I mean, that was always nonsense because, one, it implies that they actually do care about veterans, but two, that Democrats somehow don't. This should be a bipartisan issue. And yet, as always, Republicans in Congress have no intention of opposing these changes at the VA. In an act of defiance, though, against Donald's awful cuts, veterans are speaking up. An August 19th New York Times article explored Donald's decision to end Housing First and HUD-VASH VA programs that have combated veterans' homelessness since 2010. In the piece, multiple veterans stated that instituting drug tests as a prerequisite for receiving housing aid could be a massive hurdle for veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. That's because having a stable living situation lays the foundation that helps these people achieve sobriety. I can think of very few things more stressful than not having anywhere to live. So how could we possibly expect people who are suffering from PTSD to suddenly solve their problems with addiction while they are living on the streets? Maybe Donald and his sycophantic enablers should try listening to our veterans instead of deciding not what's right for them, but more creative ways to harm them by cutting the services that they deserve and that they've earned. So this is just another way of asking the question, who are we as Americans? Do we want to be the kind of country that treats its veterans so horrifically that service to one's country is rendered meaningless? Please take a second and like and share this video. It'd be awesome if you could subscribe to the channel. If you're listening to us in podcast form, please follow us and give the show a 5-star rating because it really does help other people find our content. Thanks.